The two events today are dedicated to the industrial heritage. We will first have a talk, after which you can have a bite and a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, after which we'll have a discussion with several experts from different countries. We will have the opportunity to touch upon very interesting comparative contexts, so you're all encouraged to stay with us, to stay tuned, as it were, and we are most grateful to Dr. Dagmar Kieft for having found the time to see us, to visit us here. And I will just say a few words about our speaker today. Dr. Dagmar Kieft is a historian and head of the research department and also deputy director at the LWL Industriemuseum in Dortmund. It's known in German as LWL Industriemuseum, which is a Westphalian land industry culture museum, which has several locations and unites a number of objects, both in the Westphalia, Nordrhein-Westfalen and Lippe region. Hence this abbreviation of LWL. And Ms. Dagmar Kieft studied history and German literature at the Freie Universität Berlin and at Oxford. She completed a doctoral thesis, or perhaps we'd call it the doctoral thesis, dedicated to the British Music Hall. And her subsequent book was known as The Victorian Music Hall Culture, Class and Conflict. It came out in 1996. And in this already mentioned museum in Dortmund, she was curator for a long time. She was responsible for the permanent exhibition concept, and was also the author of the exhibition in the Zollern Colliery, which is now also a museum. She is, I think, in her work, the most interesting aspect is that she unites, on the one hand, the story of production and industry and economics with cultural and social history, and it's quite interesting that she also looks at gender studies. She also works on gender studies in connection with the phenomenon of the industrial and also migration, and also cultural history of mining, of coal mining and miners. Now, Dagmar Kieft also is a member of the Society for the Study of Historical Migration and the Social History Society of the United Kingdom, as well as she belongs to the Work Lab. She's on the board of the Work Lab team, which is an international association of labor museums. So you can see that she has a very extensive resume, very extensive spectrum of interests, and very interdisciplinary story, very interdisciplinary approach. I think that's also very interesting in the sense that all of this can not just be studied, not just be looked at, but also presented in museums for the broader public. How we can see the industrial not just as some sort of period in history that also touched upon Ukraine, and which probably continues in the world. I mean, this industrial society project continues to an extent, but at the same time, we can look at this we can see this as heritage, as something that is valuable in a cultural sense, because probably in here in Lviv it's particularly relevant, because of course we're all used to the idea that Lviv presents itself through heritage, through kind of both national heritage or imperial heritage, or something that is old and pretty, and something that can be described in the categories of high culture, but rather marginalized are other aspects of industrial and workers' history, industrial history, and for all of us, this is also quite a challenge, how we could look at this differently, how we could view the history of Lviv and history of Ukraine differently, the history of the industrial regions here in Ukraine that we have, what sort of prospects and what sort of opportunities we have to turn these industrial regions into to transform these industrial regions. So thank you again, Dr. Dagmar Kieft, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this extensive introduction and for the invitation to talk here, which I will do with great delight. I shall begin my presentation with where industrial heritage started. In other words, in the Ruhr area, one of Germany's industrial heartlands and its center for coal mining and steelmaking for over 150 years. From there, I will sketch out the development of industrial heritage in Germany and deal with the various phenomena and issues industrial heritage includes today. That is preservation and musealization, urban and cultural revitalization, tourism and audiences. Looking at all that, industrial heritage seems to be a kind of success story today. Nonetheless, there are also a couple of problems and difficulties which I shall discuss at the end, and two issues I would like to mention right at the start. I was asked to talk about how Germany overcame the post-industrial depression using culture as a recourse and tool for revitalization and bringing new life to industrial areas. Culture in general and industrial heritage in particular undoubtedly has proved to be a tool for revitalization and did bring new life and confidence to industrial areas, and you will see this in my presentation. But culture alone is not a tool to overcome post-industrial or other economic depressions. The other point I want to make is you will see a lot of colorful pictures in bright sunshine, and they are not fake, they are real, but they show the area as it is today and the new image the area wants to convey. If you had seen the same pictures, the same sites 60 years ago, they would have looked like pictures from all areas dominated by coal. They would have been rather dusty, dirty and unhealthy. This picture, unfortunately, is not very good, but the important point is the red dots you see. The red dots are coal mines which are closed since 1958. Or in other words, in 1958, each dot represents a coal mine. At the moment, there are 3 left, and in 2018 they will all be gone. A major wave of coal mine closures occurred in 1966. This year also saw the closure of the Zollern mine in Dortmund, which, when it was built around of the last century, was the flagship of one of the major coal mining companies. Zollern housed one of the first electrically driven main shaft winding engines and could boast of an outstanding architecture documenting the development from historicism to Art Deco. The entrance to the engine house was similar to those of the Paris metro stations, as you can see in this old photograph. In 1969, the engine house was supposed to be demolished in order to make room for a trading estate. This was entirely in accordance with the spirit of the time, when planners wanted to raze defunct buildings to make room for new enterprises. During the actual structural crisis of the 1960s and 70s, almost nobody, neither the entrepreneurs, nor the former workers, nor the local inhabitants, were in favor of keeping the old building shells and the memory of what they represented. In the case of the Zollern engine house, it was a small but influential middle-class grassroots movement of architects, artists and art historians who protested against demolishing such a piece of outstanding architecture and technical equipment. Their protest not only saved the engine house, it also put a brake on the general practice of tearing down industrial monuments, and it helped to change public attitudes towards preserving them. At the end of 1969, the Zollern engine house was the first major industrial building in Germany to be declared a listed monument, and thus put on equal footing as medieval castles and churches. In 1973, 4 years later, the Department of Historical Monuments in the Landschaftsverband Westfalen-Lippe created a new post to deal with technical monuments, and its incumbent, Helmut Bönichhausen, later the first director of the LWL Industriemuseum, began listing and documenting outstanding industrial buildings that he believed should be preserved. In 1974, the Landschaftsverband Rheinland followed suit. And at this point I have to explain briefly what the Landschaftsverbände are, because they are institutions which only exist in the former Prussian provinces of West Germany. When those provinces became Prussian in the 19th century, the Prussians wanted them to have some kind of cultural autonomy and allowed them to have their own parliaments and administrations which were responsible for cultural affairs and heritage. That's why the Landschaftsverbände in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia deal with industrial culture. By creating institutions dedicated to the listing of industrial monuments with a view to preserving them, both Landschaftsverbände did some pioneering work towards what later would be called industrial heritage, and the state of North Rhine-Westphalia followed suit in 1980 by changing its law on listed buildings to include industrial monuments. North Rhine-Westphalia was the first German state to do this. Until the year 2000, more than 35,000 technical and industrial monuments were registered and listed in the state. Having said this, North Rhine-Westphalia did not invent industrial heritage, but was inspired by developments in the motherland of the Industrial Revolution, Great Britain. Their industrial archaeology, as industrial heritage was called, had already started in the 1950s. And a major takeoff had taken place with the first Congress of TICI, which is the International Committee for the Conservation of the Industrial Heritage, in Ironbridge in 1973. Today, TICI has branches in many countries and made industrial heritage truly global. But let's go to North Rhine-Westphalia. Let's go back to North Rhine-Westphalia. That collieries, steelworks and other industrial sites were now listed as monuments saved them from demolition, but it did not automatically give them a new lease of life. This only began when they were taken over by the Landschaftsverbände and turned into on-site industrial museums. So our museum was founded in 1979 and the counterpart in the Rhineland in 1984. The idea behind the decision to create two industrial museums was as simple as it proved convincing. A state like North Rhine-Westphalia, whose history had been so heavily dominated by industry, had a responsibility to preserve its specific heritage for current and future generations and present them as a tribute to the people whose labor had helped to create the country's wealth. As a logical consequence, the history of the people and their labor is the central focus of both the Industrial Museum's permanent exhibitions. The foundation document of the LWL Industriemuseum explicitly states that its task is to show how technical, economic, political, legal and social developments affected the lives of the people and to put the people's way of life at the center of its activities. This thematic focus was facilitated by the social historiographical turn of the time, which included a change of emphasis from major national politics and politicians to everyday life and labor and the working classes. B, it included incorporating impulses from the micro-historical dig where you stand and history workshop movements, and C, it meant working with the method of oral history in order to include the people's histories as they remembered them and wanted them to be told. The LWL Industriemuseum today consists of 3 coal mines, each of which is architecturally characteristic of a different period: 1 ironworks, 1 shiplift, 1 brickworks, 1 glass factory and 1 textile factory. In other words, the major industries of the region. Solon, the coal mine I started with, is the youngest of the 3 coal mines. The oldest is the Nightingale mine on the banks of the River Ruhr, mentioned for the first time in historical records in 1714. It introduced deep shaft mining in 1832 and grew to become the largest coal mine of the Ruhr area in the first half of the 19th century. The still existing buildings from that time include the engine house, with the oldest steam winding engine of the area restored to working order, the boiler house chimney, the workshop building, and one of the shafts. Drift mining can be witnessed in a reopened gallery dating back to the mid-19th century. When coal mining moved further north, the Nightingale mine was closed down and the site turned into a brickworks. You can see this in that big flat building. However, coal mining in the area began once more after 1945, when many mini-pits were reopened. The history of the Nightingale mine thus is typical of the first generations of pits in the Ruhr area, as well as of their revival after the Second World War. The third coal mine of the Elvel Industriemuseum is the Hanover Colliery, dating back to the 1850s. It consists of the old engine house, a building containing the ventilation machinery, and the so-called Malakoff Tower, a massive brick pithead tower and a typical piece of mid-19th century mining architecture. The name derives from the eponymous towers of the Crimean War, which is kind of strange since the Crimean War is one of the few wars Germany was not involved. The Henrichshütte Iron Works once employed a workforce of around 10,000 people, producing coke, or casting, rolling and forging iron and steel. Visitors can encounter them on their way through the site, which follows the production process. Each production unit is commented on by an exhibit, which, using photos, text, films or oral testimonies, shows people at work. Special guided tours explain what jobs the women did in the plant and what their work was like in the administration, the laboratory and the production shed. The Henrichshütte Iron Works was closed down in 1987 in the face of massive protests from the workforce and their families, and half of it actually went to China. Structural change, deindustrialization and the fight for work are therefore themes which are being dealt with there. The Henrichenburg shiplift was opened in 1899 by Kaiser Wilhelm II. The museum consists of the shiplift itself and its engine house and harbors a collection of inland waterway boats. In one of the boats there is a section of the permanent exhibition dealing with family life and work on the water. For this, the museum purchased a fully furbished boat and interviewed the former owner and his wife. The Textile Museum in Bocholt, which is a part of Westphalia specializing in textile industries, is housed in a weaving shed with running looms that give an impression of the crowded and deafening working conditions endured by weavers. Presently, we are turning a former spinning mill into the second part of this museum. At the other end, in Lage, which is in East Westphalia, we are dealing with brick making and traveling brick makers. Bricks were produced in the region, but most of its brick makers actually did not work there, but went off during the summer holidays to make bricks somewhere else. Mostly in the Ruhr area for the coal mines and the housing estates, and sometimes they even went as far as the Netherlands. Their womenfolk in that time stayed behind to work the small family farms and look after the family. Both men's and women's stories are told at the Brickworks Museum and in a workers' cottage. Bricks were produced here by hand until the brickworks were mechanized in 1922. Today the machinery is up and running once more, but visitors can try making bricks manually, thereby getting first-hand experience of the unmechanized production process. Production has also been taken up once again in the Gernheim Glassworks, built in 1826, where visitors can watch glassmakers at work, blowing and shaping the molten glass, and they can see the finished products being polished and engraved. Gernheim on the river Weser used to be a factory village and contains the oldest workers' house in Westphalia. One of the themes of its permanent exhibition is early industrial children's labor. Translating the history of work into furbishing industrial monuments meant documenting production units as workplaces, that is, making work visible where it had taken place. Where possible, and as an additional attraction for visitors, this was supplemented by restoring the machinery and putting it back into working order. Text, photographs and other exhibits were added to put the workplace documentation into broader thematic and historical context, social policies, technical development, industrial and regional history. Thus, the microcosm of the workplace was used to exemplify more general developments. This I will demonstrate by taking you back into the Zollern Colliery Museum. Zollern Colliery, today also the headquarters of the Elvia Industriemuseum, opened as a museum in 1999 after years of restoring the buildings, collecting exhibits, of which there were none left when we took over, and interviewing former members of the workforce. Miners, craftsmen, foremen, administrative staff, apprentices, miners' wives. Most of the pithead buildings and rooms thus show the diversity of work above ground and gave rise to exhibition units such as Accounting for Everybody in the Tag Checker's office, Clean and Healthy in the pithead baths, A Light in the Night in the former lamp room, and Explosion Hazards, which deals with the dangers of work accidents and accident prevention in a basement. 10 years later, a permanent exhibition in the separation plant was added following the path of coal and highlighting a workplace where many miners' working lives started and ended, where women worked during the First World War and forced laborers during the Second. More exhibition units on working underground, for example, will follow in the coming years. The other component of the museum's concept was to take the image of the mine as a model colliery and translate it into a social historical narrative. The central exhibition unit, Learning to Live, Apprenticeship, Work and Leisure, deals with a major theme in the 20th century social history of coal mining: social policies, an integral part of which was the introduction of a systematic training program for young miners. This had become necessary to meet the requirements of rationalization and mechanization in the 1920s. But its aim was also not only to train future workers in a methodical fashion, but also to tie them to the colliery after working hours. For that end, the mine owners provided the miners with a broad range of leisure activities. Young people starting work should thus be kept at arm's length from forms of leisure and workers' organization which the companies considered suspect. In the final analysis, such policies were intended to reorder social relationships in firms and redefine mining culture in the region. It didn't work in the end, but nonetheless that was a program and which we wanted to tell as a social historical narrative. Putting apprenticeship, on the other hand, at the center of the main exhibition not only enabled the museum to analyze and show work in a wider context, it also followed the didactic aim of acquainting visitors with working requirements in coal mining. Most people today know very little about coal mining, and in this respect, museum visitors are very similar to mining apprentices. In their tour of the museum, the visitors accompany the mining apprentices as they learn about the different aspects of mining. And thus they are provided with a step-by-step insight into what work in a coal mine really involved and the skills it required. And those skills were definitely more than having strong upper arms. Younger visitors are addressed by Franz, a comic figure of a mining apprentice who shares his experiences with the younger group of visitors. Presenting the story of 20th century coal mining from the miner's point of view ultimately enabled the museum to show the many aspects of miners' culture, a culture which was fed by the offers and expectations of the employers, the working class movement and the leisure industry. Presenting the story from the miners' point of view also meant considering their wives and daughters, and that's why in the exhibition unit Clean and Healthy we also deal with women's work not in the mines, respectively underground, because that was forbidden in Prussia, but with women's work for the mines, such as washing the miners' work clothes, which was taken over by the companies only in 1969. Right from the beginning, we pursued a participatory approach, and I already mentioned oral history, which included members of the former workforce in the work of the museum. We have also cooperated, or still are, with cooperating with schools and kindergartens and devised education programs which kindergarten groups or school classes can book. Today we also contact old people's homes in order to cater for all ages. Cooperations with schools have in the meantime developed into proper partnerships where we contribute to the curriculum and pupils come to the museum to learn and to do things they can only do here. One of those participatory projects was the Sound of the Ruhr project. Here more than 100 pupils came to the museum and explored the sounds of the former coal mine, recorded them, and with the help of their music teachers and 2 composers, turned them into music. They arranged the sounds, they improvised with them, and they turned them into pieces which they then performed. This was a creative approach to industrial history, made industrial history interesting for kids, involved them actively, and stimulated a number of skills and soft skills: creativity, media competence, self-presentation. Another cooperation took place during our last big exhibition on underworlds, where various schools and classes took up the theme and worked out their own interpretations and contributions, which we then included in the exhibition and treated like any other exhibits. In the 1980s and 90s, attempts to save monuments and memories of the industrial past was a trend not restricted to North Rhine-Westphalia. Several other large-scale museums with an emphasis on the history of industry and/or labor were being conceived and set up in other states or cities at the time. Of these, the following deal explicitly with industrial heritage as well. This is the Landesmuseum für Technik and Art, the State Museum of Technology and Work in Mannheim, the Museum Industriekultur in Nuremberg, the Museum of Work in Hamburg, and the Industrial Museum of Saxony, which is structurally based on the decentralized model of the 2 industrial museums in North Rhine-Westphalia. In North Rhine-Westphalia today, the 2 big industrial museums are supplemented by a whole range of smaller museums or exhibitions which aim to preserve the industrial history of that particular community or individual firm. In his guide to museums and exhibitions of industrial and social history in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, Franz Josef Jehlich lists 161 of these ventures. In most of them, the presentation of labor and working conditions play a major role. Typologically, they are the true successors of local history museums that sprang up in the early decades of the 20th century. Both types of museum tend to be the result of local initiatives, and both try to preserve the remnants of a rapidly disappearing era. The rural past at the beginning of the 20th century and the industrial past at its end. The latest big museum in North Rhine-Westphalia is the Ruhr Museum, which opened in 2010 in the former Zollverein Colliery, now a UNESCO World Heritage since 2001. But it is explicitly neither a museum of labor nor of industrial heritage. The Ruhr Museum is the successor of the old Ruhrland Museum, which, as the name suggests, had a regional rather than an industrial agenda. Within this framework, the old Ruhrland Museum had opened a new section on work and everyday life in 1984, which ushered in the representation of social and industrial history. That said, even then it did not regard itself primarily as a museum of industrial history, nor were its collections restricted to that period. They've always included exhibits from the pre-industrial eras of the region, above all archaeological, ethnographical and natural history collections. And here you can see it by night. Today's Ruhr Museum presents the region's natural and cultural history from the earliest settlements to the present day. It is structured on concepts of memorialization, and although the period of industrialization still occupies a large era, industrial labor is not its predominant theme. In other words, many of the new social history museums whether they are housed in monuments or not, are not only dedicated to industrial heritage, nor does industrial heritage only consist of listed monuments and museums. This brings us back to the Ruhr area, where industrial heritage is most prominent and today most celebrated. 10 years after the foundation of our museum, in other words in 1989, the so-called International Building Exhibition came to the Ruhr. The building exhibition, despite its name, is all sorts of things, but not an exhibition. The International Building Exhibition is an instrument of town planning and urban development, and meant to develop and then demonstrate thought-provoking impulses and projects for all sorts of improvements. It normally lasts for about 10 years to allow time to develop and implement the ideas its teams create. Before it came to the Ruhr, it took place in Berlin. In the Ruhr area, the building exhibition was to create a modern and ecological living, culture and leisure landscape in a region which had been dominated by coal and steel, and they were supposed to do this on soils which were frequently contaminated. Together with 17 municipalities, more than 100 projects were realized. Among them, the renaturation of the River Emscher, until then a kind of open sewer, the Landschaftspark Duisburg Nord, a leisure and recreation area on the site of an old steelworks in Duisburg, with facilities for divers, including a training center, climbers, and theater and concert rooms. A third project was the transformation of former industrial sites into modern workplaces for new industries and services, and the support of projects which created new jobs. And this is one of the examples. Then there was the restoration of old and the creation of new, attractive and affordable living quarters. And finally, the route of industrial heritage, which opened the industrial landscape to tourism. The Route of Industrial Heritage was a project that, like the industrial museums, aimed at locals and tourists alike. On a 400-kilometer parcours, it connects monuments, museums, housing sites and points of interest. It is structured by 25 anchor points. There are 16 panoramic viewpoints and 13 residential estates from different periods. They are marked by the yellow needle you can see on the lower picture, and on the picture above, visitors are provided with a lot of text to inform themselves if they want to do so. Some of the route's anchor points are also part of ERI, the European Route of Industrial Heritage, which covers disused production plants, industrial landscapes, and interactive technology museums in many European countries. Another project marketing the sites of industrial heritage and emphasizing their potential for tourism, plus documenting the region's change from heavy industries to culture, is the Extra Shift. The Extra Shift started in 2010, takes place once a year in June, and lasts from evening till 2 o'clock in the morning. For this event, all participating institutions open their doors all night and put on special programs to entertain and impress their visitors. They provide theatre, music and other performances, fireworks and light shows. The visitors pay a ticket with which they get into all sites and can use the shuttle bus that connects the sites. It is a major logistic enterprise for which the region is divided into 4 parts. Each is covered by 1 shuttle bus, and then there are certain points where the shuttle buses meet and you can explore another region. As a matter of fact, since you have to wait quite some time, buses are sometimes full, you can do 2 or 3 sites a night, but it went down very well with the people. Everybody is in a good mood, everybody is having a lot of fun, and the last Extra Shift was last weekend, and attracted 220,000 people. The Ruhr Triennale, another new event format, addresses a rather middle-class and international audience interested in the arts. It started in 2002 with the intention to put the Ruhr area on the international festival map and to underline the change from heavy industry to modern culture. It is a theatre and music festival which takes place not every 3 years, but for a period of 3 years, and each period has a specific motto which the respective artistic director defines. Ruhr Triennale takes place in many former industrial sites, and the Jahrhunderthalle in Bochum, which you can see here, is its center. And the Jahrhunderthalle also used to be a project of the International Building Exhibition. According to their own website, music, dance, theatre, performance and fine arts in the former industrial buildings of the Ruhr area, that's the Ruhr Triennale. Its venues are the region's outstanding industrial monuments, transformed each year into spectacular sites for impressive arts production. At the center of all this are contemporary artists seeking a dialogue with industrial spaces and between the disciplines. And this is one very important feature of the Triennale, because what they do is not have conventional opera, theater or concerts in an exotic setting, but they try to have new pieces, new performances which are actually in dialogue with the environment and together form a sort of convincing whole. This year's Triennale will be about Be Embraced, a gesture of social, political and geographical embracement. I'm quoting. The spectacular performance venues include the Jahrhunderthalle, the Zollverein World Heritage Site, the Duisburg North Landscape Park, and for the first time a new colliery venture. Be Embraced is a line from Schiller's Ode to Joy, which Beethoven later set to music in his Ninth Symphony and which today is a kind of Europe hymn. The Triennale today is attracting the audience it wants to attract, and a lot of young people as well, because its artistic directors do produce and present innovative pieces which mostly correlate with the sites they are taking place. At the same time, this had helped to create a modern image of the region, and in this respect, culture certainly is an important aspect. Another image boost happened when the Zollverein Colliery and Cokery in Essen was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2001. 9 years later, the Zollverein World Heritage Site became one of the landmarks of the European of the European Capital of Culture in 2010, in which Essen and the whole area took part. Sorry. The prize-winning motto of the European Capital of Culture was change through culture and culture through change. And the aim was to show what a whole region did and could do to reinvent itself. There were a number of thematic strands which structured the hundreds of events which were taking place. These were, for example, understanding the Ruhr myth, which dealt with the region's heritage of coal and steel, work and solidarity, football, migration and cultural diversity. Another strand was Build the Metropolis, which was an attempt to continue the work of the International Building Exhibition, extended by so-called artistic interventions, many of them in public spaces, and with the intention to turn a polycentric region with 53 municipalities into a metropolis, which did work in the heads of many people, but not in the offices of the 53 mayors involved. Another strand was discover old and new images, which was meant to create a new perception of the region. Then there was a strand on theatre with productions intending to cross the lines between milieus, generations, languages and cultures. Another strand was live music, which included, among other things, providing each willing child with an instrument for a year, an homage for the composer Hans Werner Henze, who neither came from nor lived in the area, and the enormous I Sing Day of Song event, which filled the Gelsenkirchen football stadium, home to Schalke 04 for those of you interested in football, with over 600 choirs and 22,800 amateur singers. Support the new creative industry was yet another strand with the intention to initiate the development of so-called creative quarters and long-term structures in all creative areas. Then finally, and very important for the region, was Celebrate. This included the opening and the finale and a remarkable picnic on the motorway, for which event the main thoroughfare in the Ruhr area, 60 kilometers between Dortmund and Düsseldorf, were blocked completely for cars and turned into a site for picnic, which happened on the north side of the motorway, and the south part of it was open for bicyclists and skaters and roller skaters. Everybody who's been in the area knows that as a motorway it's blocked apart from maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, and most times of the day you are quicker if you walk. And the funny thing with this picnic was, as you can see, it was equally blocked. There was hardly any movement, so it was just as ever. One of the events also include the disastrous Love Parade, which moved from Berlin to Duisburg, but there was a panic and the emergency exits weren't big enough, so more than 20 people died, which was quite a damper on the whole event. Apart from that, European Capital of Culture drew more than 10.5 million visitors and raised the tourist quota by 13.4%. What is left in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, the Ruhr Authority are cooperating to continue some of the ideas which took off in 2010, and some of the cultural projects are still being supported, like the Day of Song, or projects on cultural diversity or creative economy. And the region is presently trying to extend the World Heritage title beyond Zollverein and Essen. What means and to which end do we study universal history was the title of Friedrich Schiller's inaugural lecture at Jena University in 1789. And this question is a good starting point for all projects. How do we define what we are doing and what are we aiming at by doing it? To define industrial heritage is, however, difficult because it combines many aspects and some of them overlap with other fields. Industrial heritage encompasses a wide range of remains. To start with, there are the obvious things such as buildings and landscapes, mines, steelworks and factories, bridges and railway stations, ports, shipyards and ship lifts, water towers, gasometers, waste tips, machinery. But industrial heritage also includes cultural artifacts and immaterial things, such as social and cultural practices, specific practices which develop in a society dominated by hard labor and migration. These include, among others, specific images of maleness, specific forms of solidarity in the labor movement and in the housing settlements, or, for example, industrial art created by professionals as well as by amateurs. Now, this is the work of an amateur. And there's a lot of the latter, because due to the fact that entrepreneurs and unions both encouraged miners and steelworkers in the 1950s to paint or sing and gave them space for exhibitions and concert, in a joint effort, to settle a migrating workforce and make them feel part of a common industrial culture of coal and steel. So we have quite a complex subject when we talk about industrial heritage to start with. And equally complex or diverse are its present usages as historical museums, as living and working environments, as innovative venues for the arts, as original tourist attractions. All of this today is highly appreciated by locals and visitors alike, and supported by local, regional and state authorities as well as a lot of grassroots networks whose members look after their local industrial monument, organize guided tours, run an old railway and things like that. Industrial heritage is also a multidisciplinary network consisting of monument conservators, architectural and technical restorers, historians and ethnologists, museologists and educators, sociologists, architects and town planners, event managers and tourism experts. In 2010 they all came together in an international conference in the headquarters of our museum, organized by the main actors of industrial heritage in North Rhine-Westphalia, the state, both Landschaftsverbände, the regional authority for the Ruhr, and the towns of Dortmund and Essen. During the conference, experts, practitioners and users discussed the present and the future of industrial heritage, its relevance for the development of places and regions during structural change, its upkeep, role and function between event and history. Interdisciplinary sections dealt with industrial museums and their role in a society shaped by cultural diversity, with networks and support structures, with industrial monuments as resources and potentials. The conference ended with the participants agreeing on and passing a resolution which outlines the possible future development of industrial heritage in North Rhine-Westphalia, and they committed themselves to preserve the landscape and develop it with respect to its history, use industrial monuments as potential for urban development, cooperate with industrial companies, preserve authentic objects and the knowledge about industrial heritage, and cooperate with schools and institutions of adult education, use the potential of industrial monuments as places of technical education and to interest young people for technical jobs. Cooperate with tourism to develop and market industrial heritage sites as tourist attractions. The conference quite impressively demonstrated what's been happening in the field during the last 30 years, but it also addressed conflicting interests and problems. For example, despite the fact that industrial heritage is one of the key features that sets the state of North Rhine-Westphalia apart from other states, and is heavily subsidized by this state, it is still underrepresented in the state's tourist marketing, probably because it conveys an old image. Tourism experts say that they're very much interested in industrial heritage, but demand simple messages from institutions they want to and should advertise. Museums, on the other hand, find it difficult to accommodate that with their educational goals, because what they have to tell does not always fit into a short slogan. Urban developers are afraid that keeping industrial monuments prevents economic and only allows touristic redevelopments, because important spaces would be blocked. But others pointed out that these spaces mostly are not in the way of any developments because they are at the outskirts of the cities. Other critics of industrial heritage declared it to be a phenomenon of the 1970s, instigated and supported by the male middle class, and they claim that industrial heritage is looking back rather than looking forward. That industrial heritage as a movement did originate in the 1970s and was male and middle class is certainly true. But first, the audience's industrial heritage draws today come from all classes, ages and sexes, as visitors' statistics show. And secondly, historical museums by definition do look back, but by doing this they help building and remembering identity and help their visitors to better understand the present. Moreover, they are educational institutions with special attractions which can be used to deal with all sorts of themes and questions. They have the authenticity of real places where things happened, and they provide their themes not only in glass cases, but transmit them intellectually and emotionally, visually and haptically. In other words, they address all senses. This is rather more in the present than in the past, and that also holds true for all the touristic sites and offers. For industrial monuments are places for art or popular festivals, for heritage trails and cycling paths, and they form very attractive leisure options. For events like the Night of Industrial Culture or the picnic of the area's major motorway, which I mentioned. What everybody agreed on the conference was that industrial heritage is and remains important, because it was the industrial history which gave it a profile, setting it apart from other regions, and that it is worth remembering because it is an essential part of local and regional identity. All this sounds very much like a success story, and in many aspects industrial heritage has developed to be one over the last years. But it was not easy or smooth sailing, and with that I want to finish. And it won't be easy in other regions which think about using culture as a resource and tool for revitalization. When industrial heritage in Germany started in the 1970s, only a minority wanted it, respectively wanted to preserve even outstanding industrial monuments. In particular, those most involved in industry were not interested. The entrepreneurs wanted to get rid of defunct buildings and rusting machinery as quickly as possible, and the workers regarded these monuments as monuments of structural crises and job losses and of being left out and down. They preferred money to be invested in the creation of new jobs rather than in the preservation of former workplaces. It took more than a generation, and perhaps a new generation, to have industrial heritage widely accepted, and it needed a lot of good concepts and offers catering for a variety of interests to get it accepted. One cannot do industrial heritage without involving the people concerned, and this is a lot of work and costs a lot of effort. Second point, industrial heritage is not cheap. You need a lot of money to restore buildings, to make sure the upkeep is settled, to have to pay the people who work in them, and to restructure a region for tourists. Building cycling paths also costs a lot of money, and the cyclists don't bring any back. Finally, industrial heritage needs patience, because it's a long process lasting more than a generation, and as I said, it only succeeds if you take the people with you. So does industrial heritage make sense? What can you achieve by it? Where does it make a difference? Industrial heritage, and I mentioned this at the beginning of my presentation, does and cannot solve structural crises. Cultural and industrial heritage did create new jobs, but the unemployment figures, particularly in the Ruhr area, still hover between 11 and 14%, are the highest in Germany and more than twice as high as the national average. And that would be even worse had culture been the only tool for redevelopment. In fact, most cities in the Ruhr, and this I would briefly mention, have also tried to restructure their economy in the last 50 years, and quite successfully so. Dortmund, for example, formerly known for the trinity of coal, steel and beer, is now a center for insurance companies. Like other towns in the area, it has founded a university around which a lot of logistic firms have sprung up. The first university in the area is the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum, founded in the 1960s, around which a lot of firms specializing in medical technology have developed. Both towns see their future in services rather than in industries, but the new jobs created here still not have replaced the ones lost during structural change. And other options failed. So Bochum in the 1960s convinced Opel to come to town, and the factory just closed. To sum up, industrial heritage is not a major economic factor and certainly no overall remedy for economic depressions. But it is an important cultural factor, creating attractive environments and sites, and addressing identity and self-esteem of the people who live there. Despite of its being heritage, it does not so much point to what is not there anymore and what we lost, but highlights what we have, what we did, and what we can be proud of, and that we can master change without losing touch to our roots. It can provide self-confidence and change a region's appearance and image. And this is important for the people who live or move in the regions affected by structural change, and for the people the region wants to attract into new jobs. And with that, and with a little piece of self-confidence and a new image, I would like to end by showing, or asking Evgeny to show the trailer of the Ruhr 2010 European Cultural Capital of the Year. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Добре, дуже
Дуже дякуємо за
Thank you very much for this very saturated, very thick presentation and this very inspired conclusion to it. Obviously, we all thought about what sort of future Ukraine might have in this light, what sort of potential we might have, and what we might want to achieve in future and see in our industrial regions. This is us and Ivan kind of thinking about this here, and I now ask you to ask questions. You can ask in Ukrainian. We do have translation. Maybe I'll start. Dr. Keith. Dr. Kieft, obviously you've been to many conferences where these things are discussed, industrial heritage. Would you perhaps call the most, what would be the most controversial issue that are sort of at the edge, the cutting edge of this study? Would you? Was my question clear? Or
yeah. What strikes me is that that the success, what has been achieved, is regarded very highly, and a lot of things have been achieved, as you could see. But one objection is, isn't this all sort of romantic, an industrial romantic. What's the relevance for today? But I think if you do concentrate on education and culture and develop the environment, or fill the environment with new ideas and projects, you can sort of have a development rather than looking back and thinking, well, that factory looks impressive and that steelworks must have been a huge site. So preserving the old sites of industry can be a resource for new projects which are of relevance for today. For example, with the Ruhr Triennale, the Ruhr area has or is actually taking a position in the international festival concourse. This might not be important for the people who live there because it only gives very few jobs and they are temporary, but it boosts the image of the region, and if you want to attract new industries and new people, they still have to cope with the old image of grey and dusty and dirty and unhealthy, and to show that it's worth living there is also important for redevelopment, because people who come there want good schools for their children, they want attractive offers for their leisure time, like good theatres, good concerts, good bicycling paths, interesting sites. But we are still working on it because people from other parts of Germany still consider the region as grey. And when somebody says, well, I'm doing my cycling holiday in the Ruhr area, the neighbors normally say, you must be completely mad. So it will take a few more times, but things are improving a little bit. But of course, culture does not create the jobs that are being lost by the Depression.
I have two questions. You mentioned quite a high number of listed heritage sites, industrial heritage sites in the area, and you showed some selected examples, success stories. So my first question is that what is the average, what happened to the rest of these sites? And my second question is that, as you mentioned, here it was a continuous process of how industry ran out in the area and its heritage business came in. And in this part of Europe, we have these hundreds, thousands of industrial sites which have already been abandoned even for several decades now. And do you have any experience based on what you have seen in this field? In what respect different strategies are needed, and what are the possible strategies in these cases?
The first initiatives by the Landschaftsverbände only saved a dozen or so sites. Smaller sites are not museums. Many smaller sites are run by grassroots movements who are very fond of their own steam engine, and they restore it, or like old steam locomotives, they restore them, and they have sort of open Sundays where they present them or drive around, and they have built networks where you can go with an old steam engine and old train to another site. So networks have developed where these local initiatives can present what they preserve, and sometimes they get a little bit of money for restoration. So that is a wide movement of grassroots initiatives, which also keeps up a lot of very small venues. And then there's another development which I didn't mention. The International Building Exhibition did turn some old coal mines, or part of the buildings of coal mines, into living quarters or new offices or whatever. A lot of stuff has been erased because if you don't keep the buildings up, they just collapse on top of you, like the pithead gear gets rusty and then it gets unstable. So a lot of things have already disappeared, in fact, and not every town wants to keep their own pithead gear. So a lot of things have vanished. And then IBA, the International Building Exhibition, managed to find an agreement with the coal industry and did something which might be a good idea for other regions as well. They worked out how much it would cost to get completely rid of a factory site, and then say, give us the money to do some basic upkeeps and leave it open for the public and deal with the getting rid of the thing later. Because, I mean, getting rid is also expensive, especially if everything is contaminated.
Будь ласка, спершу ви, потім ви.
Пані Дагмар, дякую дуже за таку хорошу.
Dr. Kieft, thank you very much for this presentation. I was trying to compare, in listening to you, what was happening in the eastern Ukraine, where I come from. So, and back in the day, I had to do with the Agency for Regional Development, and then I was also thinking, well, why aren't there colliery museums or mine museums, which were closed down in the 90s? Why is this part of history not a heritage for Ukrainians now? So, looking at the map today at the map of the industrial past of Germany's industrial past, I'm just trying to kind of visualize a future for Ukraine, both for eastern part and for western part. But the question is a different thing. You say that that industrial material object, that it's very difficult to raise them and expensive. But what do we do with the memory of the people? To what extent these projects and this industrial history, to what extent did you manage to build a dialogue, establish the dialogue between generations of present-day young Germans and the Germans who had worked in the mines, in the steelworks, to what extent can we say that the young people understand this part of history, and to what extent does the older generation remain not isolated in their memories, in their memory, but is also part of the modern present-day context?
Well, as I indicated at one point in my paper, the former workers at the start were not exactly hostile, but something between disinterested and hostile. And it took us a great effort and the help of some interested people to actually get close to them. First of all, they were angry that their workplaces should be kept as museums with no work for themselves, and why put money in that thing rather than creating new jobs. Then they never had dealt with curators or academics. The regions didn't have any universities because the ruling classes didn't want universities in an area where they only wanted to have workers. So they didn't know students or academics, and when we started to interview them, or wanted to interview them, they thought we were from the tabloid papers and would take and falsify what they said. So it took us a lot of effort to actually get them to talk to us, and we got the help of some engaged local inhabitants. And then it took another long time till they could actually see what we were doing with the things they gave us and the stories they told us. And when they realized that we were quite respectable and truthful and trustworthy, they opened up much more. So this is a very hard process because you are not one of them, and you have to get their trust and confidence. A generation later, people realized that in their old days they can actually get famous with the help of the museum. So right now they are rather willing to give interviews and tell us our stories. Then the other thing, the oldest miner I had to do with started work in 1917. I mean, he's dead like most of the first generation of miners we interviewed. There's still many of them left because we also interviewed people who started work in the 1950s. Now we put their exhibits in our exhibition, and what we realized is that they came back to their former place of work and proudly showed it to their visitors and relatives, and then they sort of deliberately act as guides. So they show them specific exhibits like cigarette packs from the 1950s, and told them how they got them, how they smoked them, how they secretly smoked them in corners where they were not supposed to smoke them. So they tell stories which are not part of the exhibition, not in text, but it's the exhibits which makes them talk and which makes them connect with their grandchildren and children. And what they also came to value is the fact they are experts on a very narrow field. The field they were working as hewer or as overseer or as tag checker or whatever, and the museum presents the rest of the cake, and they get to know their own workplace better. And since we took sides with their story, they now feel rather attached to these things. We also use, for example, in the Hanover Gallery, that's the one with the Malakoff Tower, we have a replica as a children's playground. And you can book programs where children act as minors. So what they learn is to, it's not with coal, it's with stones, because they would get terribly dirty if they had to work with coal. So they shovel coal into a bucket, then they move the bucket to the shaft, and then they have to pedal the winding engine and get the stones up on the ground. And what they learn is the basic functions of a coal mine, but also that you have to work as a group, that you need solidarity amongst yourselves. So it's the soft skills which we address as well by things like that.
I have the following question. Thank you very much for your interesting and stimulating lecture, because I'm... 1, 2, 3, can you hear me?
Hello?
1, 2, 3, can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. It's been very interesting to listen to you, and it looks very beautiful on site there, especially at nighttime. But when I was listening, maybe I'm a pessimist, but it sounds like fantasy, like fiction. Because I've been thinking of the eastern part of Ukraine, because in the east of Ukraine we have a lot of potential industrial heritage like that. But when I was listening to you, I was thinking, what realistically can we do with this industrial heritage? Do you know any examples of other countries with worse economic situation? And another problem in Ukraine is that our communities are not ready for that. Maybe you know examples of some countries where there was no grassroots movement, so people were not really ready to support the preservation of industrial heritage. So are you familiar with examples from other countries similar to Ukraine in terms of economic situation and lack of understanding on the part of the community, maybe in Latin America?
No, I actually don't, because most examples I know is industries finished, grassroots movements pick up attempts to conserve the heritage, and they get support by various institutions. Industrial heritage is a network, and I don't know of any examples where it actually worked without further support. And it, in most cases, it took or takes place in areas where the industries which become a part of the industrial heritage don't work anymore. So I think I can imagine it's very difficult to come with the idea of industrial heritage into a region where people are still working in the mines, and to tell them, well, we take this away from you and turn this into a museum. I don't think this will go down well with the people concerned. And the other point is, we were very lucky, because restoring our sites, the Landschaftsverband paid 10% of the restoration costs, and the state of North Rhine-Westphalia paid 90% of the restoration costs. And they were part of an EU program on revitalizing areas with structural problems. I mean, there was a lot of support outside the actual venture.
Thank you very much. I would like to add to that question, because this question is very topical for Ukraine. And I also want to ask a similar question. Did I get it right that part of Germany's success was in the strong regional character of Germany, because a lot of responsibility and a lot of power is in the hands of states, in the hands of regional communities? And of course, it's very topical in Ukraine in light of the national discussion on the necessity for decentralization in the country. So I think it's one of the factors. Decentralization might help Ukraine preserve some of the local heritage that we have. And the second question that I have, are there examples of how back in the times of socialism in Eastern Germany, such museums were created or maybe were not created? I mean, industrial heritage museums. So did they appear in Eastern Germany in the times of socialism? Because I think that the epoch of socialism perceived everything industrial as something present, not as something past. So basically, for socialism, everything industrial is about the present and about the bright future. So I'm just wondering whether a similar industrial heritage movement was observed in Eastern Germany in the 1970s and 80s. So were industrial facilities transformed into industrial monuments? And another question on the power of regionalism.
Well, to answer the first question, Germany is a federal state. Culture is one of the issues which the central state is not responsible for. It lies with the regional states. Whether that helps or not is a question of how willing the regional state will be to put their attention to industrial heritage and actually find some money to do it. The answer to your second question, and that will partly maybe answer your question as well. In the GDR, there were quite a number of prominent technical historians who would have liked to do something similar and to delve in their work with potential technical monuments that should be preserved. But the GDR was not interested in spending money in a past that didn't produce anything or didn't bring in any money. And the big industrial museum in the former GDR, the Industrial Museum of Saxony, was only founded quite a couple of years after the unification. And it's not in a very good position financially because it hasn't got the strong state support that we have. I mean, we might get less money by the year, but we survive and we can try and find other money, but we won't be closed. Whereas the Industrial Museum of Saxony might be closed, and several times already was on the brink of being closed. So it's a very fragile construction.
Будь ласка, ще питання? Якщо вже немає питань,
Are there any other questions? I also have a question. You said that very often such initiatives on the creation of museums or landscape parks encountered misunderstanding or opposition on the part of entrepreneurs and those companies that used to own this industrial heritage. So what was the mechanism of finding a common language and reaching consensus with these entrepreneurs? Did the regional power purchase these industrial sites and facilities, or maybe there were some other mechanism of reaching consensus, or maybe there were some other examples when entrepreneurs themselves invested their own money into preserving this industrial heritage?
Well, the answer to your last question is a definite no. And with most industrial heritage sites, they're still not giving any money. They only could be convinced to not tear down some of their sites, but use the money they would have had to spend in sort of roughly preserve them and open them to the public. And we don't know what happens if those buildings need repairs. The entrepreneurs of the Ruhr area, and they are themselves in a problematic position because coal mining will close. They put some money aside which they will need to pump the water, air what's left, because otherwise the whole region will sort of literally go down. So they have to spend a lot of money in we call them eternity problems, and they will be eternal. They're also not interested in supporting the idea of industrial heritage. They do give money for cultural events, but then there are the big cultural events with a really big C, which attract international attention. They were supposed to contribute to the European Capital of Culture year, and the budget was something about 6 million, and they were supposed to contribute 8 of them. I think they gave 2.5 million, which is really very little money.
Я дуже дякую. Напевно, наш час уже закінчився, на жаль, але поза сумнівом ми продовжимо.
Really sorry, but the time allocated for this lecture has run out. We're really grateful for your questions and for your participation. If you have any questions, you can approach our lecturer after the lecture and ask any questions that you still have. Thank you very much.